In the roaring heart of Los Angeles sports arena, a cocky young champion was about to turn jeers into bait. A celebration of martial arts tradition turned combustible when Joe Louis mocked Chuck Norris's legendary kicks and dared him to prove they were real. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical Hollywood star. For years, he was a six-time world karate champion, known for his precision roundhouse kick that humbled opponents long before it became a cinematic trademark. When Joe Louis taunted and challenged him in front of thousands, he had no idea he was inviting a masterclass. Chuck's calm acceptance and surgical counter would trigger a collision between arrogance and discipline that electrified the arena. What began as showboating bravado would become a public lesson in humility. The martial arts world and every spectator in that stadium would never be the same after Chuck Norris unleashed one perfect spin kick. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Los Angeles sports arena crackled with electric anticipation on this sweltering July night in 1985. Neon lights slashed through artificial fog, casting an otherworldly glow across the packed house. Every seat was filled shoulder to shoulder, the crowd a living, breathing entity of its own. Men with mullets and women with teased hair pressed against the barriers, their faces painted with expectation. The smell of popcorn, beer, and the faint tang of sweat hung in the air. This was the West Coast Martial Arts Championship, the most prestigious tournament in America, where reputations were forged and legacies were destroyed in the blink of an eye. At the center of it all stood the eight-sided cage, bathed in spotlight, waiting like an altar for its sacrifices. Metal barriers separated the combatants from the fans, but nothing could contain the raw energy surging through the building. Banners plastered the walls, Budweiser, Coca-Cola, and promotional posters for upcoming action films. This was the golden age of martial arts in America, when fighters could become celebrities overnight, and movie stars were expected to actually know how to fight. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer's voice boomed through speakers, cutting through the din. Welcome to the championship finals. The crowd roared in response, thousands of voices merging into a wall of sound. In the front row, barely visible among the VIPs and industry executives, sat Chuck Norris. Unlike the flashy celebrities around him, he wore a simple black jacket over a crisp white shirt, his auburn beard neatly trimmed. No entourage surrounded him, no photographers hovered nearby. He sat with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove, his eyes fixed on the cage with laser focus. To the casual observer, he might have been just another spectator. But those who knew fighting recognized the six-time world karate champion, the man whose legendary roundhouse kick had become his Hollywood signature. Chuck had come tonight as a spectator, not a competitor. At 45, his tournament days were behind him, but his passion for the art remained undiminished. His posture was relaxed, yet alert, hands resting lightly on his knees. He nodded occasionally to fans who recognized him, but his attention never wavered from the upcoming fight. In the red corner, the announcer continued, with a professional record of 26 wins and only 2 losses, the veteran warrior, the man they call the Old Guard, David Chen. A man in his late 30s emerged from the tunnel, his weathered face a map of hard-fought battles. He raised a single fist in acknowledgement as a portion of the crowd applauded respectfully. David Chen was a fighter's fighter, technically sound, humble, the kind of martial artist who bowed to his opponents and helped them up after knocking them down. His once black gi was faded to charcoal from countless washings, the white belt around his waist in stark contrast to his humility. The wrinkles around his eyes deepened as he smiled, soaking in what might be his final moment in the spotlight. Chuck nodded slightly, recognizing Chen's quiet dignity. They had crossed paths years ago in smaller competitions, and Chuck respected the man's dedication to traditional values in an increasingly commercialized sport. And in the blue corner, the announcer's voice rose an octave, practically vibrating with excitement. With an undefeated record of 15 straight victories, all by knockout, the rising star, the self-proclaimed face of fighting, Joe Louis! The arena exploded. Half the crowd leapt to their feet, screaming adoration. The other half booed and jeered with equal passion. But all eyes turned to the tunnel. Smoke billowed out as "Eye of the Tiger" blasted through the speakers. A figure emerged, arms raised in premature victory. Joe Louis was 26, 6'2", and built like a Greek statue. His custom-made red and gold gi was adorned with sponsorship patches, and his hair, a perfect golden mullet, seemed to catch the light from every angle. He strutted toward the cage like he owned not just the arena but everyone in it. "Who wants to see a knockout tonight?" he shouted, not waiting for the microphone. The crowd's reaction was immediate, a cacophony of cheers and jeers that only widened his Cheshire cat grin. Joe was everything the media loved: brash, photogenic, and controversial. He'd risen through the ranks like a comet, leaving broken opponents and sound bites in his wake. His fighting style matched his personality: flashy, aggressive, designed to humiliate rather than merely defeat. As Joe sauntered past the VIP section, his eyes swept across the celebrities and paused momentarily on Chuck Norris. Something flickered across his face recognition, perhaps even a flash of insecurity before his smirk returned, broader than before. He winked at Chuck before continuing his procession. Chuck's expression never changed, but something sharpened in his gaze. He had seen fighters like Joe before, talented but undisciplined, confusing arrogance for confidence. Inside the cage, the referee called both fighters to the center. David Chen bowed respectfully. Joe Louis rolled his eyes, bouncing on the balls of his feet, clearly impatient for the fight to begin. "I want a clean fight," the referee instructed. "Obey my commands at all times. Touch gloves and return to your corners." Chen extended his hand. Joe slapped it away. "Save the respect for after I put you to sleep, old man," Joe said, loud enough for the front row to hear. The crowd's reaction split the arena boos, clashing with cheers as Joe backpedaled, playing to his fans. Chuck leaned forward slightly in his seat, recognizing the disrespect for what it was: not strategy, but character revealed. The bell rang. Chen approached cautiously, hands high in a traditional guard. Joe circled, light on his feet, a predator toying with prey. The first minute was a dance, Chen probing with measured jabs, Joe slipping them with exaggerated ease. "Come on, Grandpa," Joe taunted. "My grandmother hits harder than that." Chen remained focused, ignoring the psychological warfare. But Joe was more than just talk. When he struck, it was with lightning speed, a front kick to the chest that sent Chen stumbling backward. The crowd gasped at the display of power. "That's one," Joe shouted, playing to the cameras. "How many can you take before you fall?" Chen recovered, circling more cautiously now. His eyes betrayed the first flicker of doubt. In the front row, Chuck watched with growing concern. Chen was a good fighter, but Joe was younger, faster, and fueled by a hunger that bordered on cruelty. The fight continued, Joe landing strikes with increasing frequency. Midway through the first round, he caught Chen with a spinning back fist that dropped the older fighter to one knee. "Stay down if you're smart," Joe taunted, strutting around the cage. "I'm just getting started." Chen pushed himself up, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. The referee checked on him, but Chen waved him off, determined to continue. In that moment, something changed in Joe's demeanor. His showmanship gave way to something darker, a desire not just to win but to break his opponent's spirit before his body. He pressed forward with savage intensity, forcing Chen against the cage. "This ain't a dojo, old man," Joe hissed, close enough that only Chen and those nearest the cage could hear. "This is my world now." A flurry of strikes followed a jab to the nose, a cross to the temple, an uppercut to the chin. Each one landed with surgical precision. Chen's legs buckled, and he collapsed to the mat. The referee dove between them, waving his arms to stop the fight. Joe didn't wait for the official announcement. He leaped onto the cage, arms raised, soaking in the adulation of his fans. "Who's next?" he bellowed. Medical staff rushed to Chen's side, checking his vitals, helping him into a sitting position. The veteran fighter sat dazed, blood streaming down his face, the reality of the defeat sinking in. Chuck watched impassively as the medics attended to Chen. The veteran in him recognized Joe's skill, but the man in him was troubled by the lack of respect. Joe jumped down from the cage and grabbed the microphone from the announcer, his chest heaving with exertion and adrenaline, but his smile never faltering. "That's how you end a career, folks," he crowed, pointing at Chen, who was being helped to his feet. "The old way is done. This is fighting for the new generation." The crowd's reaction was mixed enthusiastic cheers from some sections, uncomfortable silence from others. Joe fed off both, turning in a circle to take in the crowd's energy. Then his eyes landed on Chuck Norris again. Something calculated flickered across his face. The smirk widened as he saw an opportunity too tempting to resist. In the cage, David Chen limped toward the exit, supported by medics. Joe Louis circled the perimeter, a king surveying his domain, unaware that the true test of his character was about to begin. Joe Louis paced the cage like a caged tiger, sweat glistening on his chest, victory pumping through his veins. The overhead lights caught the golden sheen of his hair as he spun to face the crowd once more. Microphone clutched in his hand like a weapon. His chest heaved with exertion, but his voice rang clear and confident through the arena speakers. "That's what real fighting looks like," he shouted, gesturing toward the exit where David Chen had disappeared moments before. "No bowing, no meditation crap. Just pure dominance." Half the arena erupted in cheers, while pockets of uncomfortable silence spread among the more traditional martial arts fans. Joe fed off both reactions equally, his grin widening as he scanned the crowd. When his eyes locked onto Chuck Norris in the front row, his smile took on a predatory edge. "Well, well, well." Joe's voice dropped to a theatrical whisper that somehow carried through the entire arena. "Look who we have here tonight." Camera operators followed his gaze, and the giant screens overhead suddenly filled with Chuck's impassive face. A murmur rippled through the crowd as recognition spread. Chuck's expression remained neutral, neither acknowledging the sudden attention nor shrinking from it. "Chuck Norris himself," Joe announced, pointing directly at him. "The man, the myth, the movie star." The emphasis on those last two words was unmistakable. A subtle but clear distinction between real fighters and entertainers. The crowd's energy shifted, anticipation crackling through the air like static electricity. "You know, Chuck," Joe continued, approaching the edge of the cage nearest to where Chuck sat, "I grew up watching your movies. All those fancy spin kicks, those slow-motion roundhouses." He paused for effect. "Very entertaining. Hollywood gold." He emphasized the word entertaining with a dismissive flick of his wrist. The implications were clear to everyone in the arena. Entertainment, not fighting. Fantasy, not reality. "But I've always wondered," Joe's voice dropped an octave, becoming more intimate, as if sharing a secret with thousands. How much of that is movie magic? How much is just good editing and camera tricks? Gasps rippled through the crowd. To question Chuck Norris's legitimacy was audacious, even for someone as brash as Joe Louis. Chuck remained perfectly still, his gaze steady, but something shifted in his eyes, a barely perceptible narrowing that only those who knew him well would recognize as displeasure. Because in here, Joe slapped the cage wall for emphasis, there's no second takes, no stunt doubles, no directors yelling cut when things get too rough. The camera stayed split between Joe's animated face and Chuck's composed one, creating a visual contrast that was lost on no one. Joe was all movement and expression, while Chuck was stillness and control. "What do you say, Chuck?" Joe's voice rose again, playing to the crowd. "Why don't you step in here with me? Show everyone if those kicks of yours work against someone who hits back for real." The arena erupted. Some fans jumped to their feet, phones raised to capture the moment. Others exchanged shocked glances, unable to believe the disrespect being shown to a legend. Suddenly, from different sections of the arena, a chant began to build. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" It started small, just a few voices, then spread like wildfire until hundreds. Then thousands were calling his name. The sound rolled through the arena like thunder, drowning out even the enthusiastic cheers of Joe's supporters. Joe, far from being intimidated by the crowd's response, seemed to revel in it. He raised his arms, encouraging the chant, fueling the spectacle. "Listen to that, folks," he shouted over the noise. "They want to see it. They want to know if the legend is real." In the front row, several people turned to look at Chuck, waiting for his reaction. The martial arts icon hadn't moved. He sat exactly as before, hands resting lightly on his knees, gaze fixed on Joe. There was no anger in his expression, no indignation, just assessment, as if he were studying a curious but ultimately insignificant phenomenon. "What's the matter, Chuck?" Joe pressed, bouncing lightly on his feet. "Afraid your spin kick might not look so good without special effects? Or maybe you're worried about what happens when you're not fighting stuntmen who are paid to make you look good." Another wave of gasps swept through the crowd. Even some of Joe's fans seemed uncomfortable with the escalating disrespect. "Seems to me," Joe continued, warming to his theme, "there's a big difference between being a fighter and playing one on TV. But hey, I get it. The cameras are rolling. You've got a reputation to protect. Safer to stay in your seat." Throughout the arena, the tension was palpable. Fans held their breath. Commentators frantically tried to describe the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. Security personnel exchanged uncertain glances, unsure how to handle the situation. In the silence that followed Joe's challenge, the spotlight remained on Chuck. The chants had quieted as everyone waited for his response. Would he ignore the bait? Respond verbally? Or would he Chuck moved? The motion was so subtle that many missed it at first. He uncrossed his legs and shifted his weight forward slightly. Nothing dramatic, nothing rushed, but in that small adjustment, everything changed. The atmosphere in the arena transformed, as if the air itself had become charged with possibility. Joe noticed it too. For just an instant, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He had thrown down the gauntlet expecting to be ignored, giving him the narrative victory either way. But now, as Chuck's posture shifted, Joe realized he might have miscalculated. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Oh!" Joe recovered quickly, grinning wider. "Is the movie star actually considering it? Are we about to see if those famous kicks work in real life?" The chants resumed, louder than before. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" The cameramen zoomed in closer on Chuck's face, as he finally broke his silence, not with words, but with the smallest of smiles. Not a smile of amusement or entertainment, but the knowing expression of a predator who has just spotted prey that doesn't yet realize it's being hunted. In that moment, the contrast between the two men couldn't have been more stark. Joe, loud and performative, desperately commanding attention; Chuck, silent and measured, naturally drawing it without effort. "Come on, Chuck," Joe called out, his voice taking on a slightly strained quality beneath the bravado. "The cage is waiting. Show us what Chuck Norris can really do." As if responding to an entirely different conversation, one no one else could hear. Chuck finally stood. The motion was fluid, unhurried, yet somehow inevitable, like the rising of the tide. He shrugged off his jacket and handed it to a nearby security guard. The arena fell into stunned silence, a collective held breath. This wasn't part of the program. This wasn't planned. This was something raw and real happening before their eyes, a moment they would tell their grandchildren about decades later. Joe Louis, for all his bravado, hadn't expected this. The confident smirk flickered momentarily as Chuck began to move toward the cage. But he recovered quickly, grabbing the microphone again. "Well, would you look at that?" he shouted, his voice carrying a thin edge of nervous energy. "Chuck Norris is actually coming down. Someone check if there's a director somewhere." Yelling "Action!" the joke fell flat in the electric silence. All eyes were on Chuck as he moved with fluid grace toward the cage steps. No rushing, no hesitation, just the measured pace of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. In the announcer's booth, frantic discussions were taking place. This wasn't scheduled. There were insurance considerations, regulations, but no one dared step in front of Chuck Norris as he approached the cage door. Joe bounced on his feet, playing to his fans, trying to maintain the illusion of control. "Let's hear it for Chuck Norris, everyone. The man's got guts. I'll give him that." But the energy had shifted. The crowd sensed it. The commentators felt it. Even the cameramen, trained to remain detached, couldn't help but get caught up in the moment. Something momentous was about to happen. A collision not just of bodies, but of philosophies. Old school versus new. Respect versus arrogance. Substance versus spectacle. The cage door opened. Chuck Norris stepped through. The die was cast. The cage door swung open with a metallic groan that seemed to echo through the now hushed arena. Chuck Norris stepped through the threshold with the same unhurried confidence that had characterized his approach. No hesitation, no grandstanding, just pure intentional movement. He wore no flashy entrance robe, no custom gi like Joe's, just the white shirt he'd been wearing in the audience, sleeves now rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle that belied his 45 years. Time seemed to slow as Chuck moved into the cage. The overhead lights caught the auburn highlights in his beard, the calm determination in his eyes. Where Joe had bounded in earlier like an excitable puppy, Chuck entered like a silent predator, economical in motion, wasting nothing, commanding attention without demanding it. The contrast between the two men could not have been more striking. Joe, younger by nearly 20 years, all flash and swagger, bouncing from one foot to the other, unable to stay still. Chuck, composed and centered, each step deliberate, each breath controlled, his presence filling the cage not through theatrics but through sheer force of character. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice broke through the silence, a slight tremor betraying his surprise at this unplanned turn of events. "It appears that Chuck Norris has accepted Joe Louis's challenge." The crowd erupted again, cell phones raised high to capture the historic moment. In the press section, sports writers frantically scribbled notes, knowing they were witnessing something unprecedented. The regular rules of promotion and scheduled bouts had been cast aside. This was fighting in its purest, most primal form, a direct response to a public challenge. Security personnel conferred frantically at the edge of the platform, but none dared interrupt what was unfolding. The tournament director whispered urgently into a walkie-talkie, but his eyes never left the cage. This was either a catastrophe or the greatest promotional moment in the tournament's history, and no one was quite sure which. Inside the cage, Joe Louis's cocky grin remained plastered across his face, but a new tension had appeared around his eyes. He'd thrown out the challenge as a publicity stunt, never truly expecting it to be accepted. Now, faced with the reality of Chuck Norris standing across from him, something flashed behind his eyes. A momentary glimpse of the boy who had once admired the very man he had just insulted. But Joe was nothing if not committed to his persona. He couldn't back down now. Not with thousands watching in person and millions more about to see the footage. He raised the microphone again, determined to maintain control of the narrative. "Well, well. The movie star's actually got some guts," he called out, playing to the crowd. "Somebody better call his agent. I don't think this was in his contract." The joke fell flat in the electric atmosphere. Joe sensed it and pushed harder, circling Chuck like a shark, microphone still clutched in his hand. "No cameras? No stunt coordinator? You sure you're in the right place, Chuck?" His voice carried a forced lightness that didn't quite mask the nervous energy underneath. "This isn't a movie set. This is real fighting." Throughout Joe's monologue, Chuck remained silent. He simply stood in the center of the cage, watching Joe with the patient focus of a man who had seen countless fighters come and go, who had faced opponents in real combat when Joe was still in diapers. There was no anger in his gaze, no resentment at the disrespect, only assessment. The calculating look of a master, taking the measure of a student who had yet to learn the most important lessons. The referee, sensing the unprecedented nature of the moment, approached cautiously. "Mr. Norris," he began, his voice low. "This isn't an official bout. There are regulations, insurance considerations." Chuck acknowledged him with the slightest nod, but said nothing. His silence seemed to speak volumes. This was between him and Joe now, beyond the realm of regulations and paperwork. Joe tossed the microphone to a cornerman and began a more exaggerated warm-up routine, throwing flashy combinations at the air, each punch and kick more theatrical than practical. It was a performance meant to intimidate, to showcase his speed and power. "Hope you stretched before coming in here, Chuck," Joe called out, launching into a spinning hook kick that whistled through the air. "Would hate for you to pull something trying to keep up with me." Chuck didn't respond to the taunt. Instead, he simply raised his hands into a classic guard position. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic. Just the fundamentally sound stance that had served him through 6 world championships. He took a single step forward, closing the distance between them with deliberate intent. The arena fell silent again as Chuck finally spoke, his voice low but carrying clearly in the hush. "Let's go." Just 2 words, but they landed with more impact than Joe's entire monologue. This wasn't about talk anymore. This wasn't about cameras or crowds or reputation. This was about what happened when the talking stopped and the fighting began. Joe's smile faltered for a split second before returning, broader and more forced than before. He rolled his shoulders and cracked his neck, a final display of casual confidence. "Your funeral, old man," he muttered, just loud enough for Chuck to hear. They began to circle each other, 2 predators sizing each other up. Joe continued his performance, playing to the crowd with exaggerated feints and flashy footwork. Chuck moved with minimal effort, his eyes never leaving Joe's center mass, watching for the subtle tells that would telegraph the younger fighter's intentions. The crowd held its collective breath. Commentators whispered into their microphones, trying to capture the electric tension without breaking the spell. This was no longer entertainment, it was something ancient and primal, a test of not just skill but character. Joe's patience broke first. With a shout meant as much for the crowd as for intimidation, he launched forward with a blistering combination. A jab, cross, and high kick, designed to overwhelm Chuck with speed and aggression. What happened next would be replayed on sports channels for weeks to come. Chuck didn't retreat. He didn't flinch. With the calm precision of a surgeon, he slipped the jab, blocked the cross, and checked the kick with a simple forearm movement that seemed almost effortless. No wasted motion, no panic. Just decades of muscle memory and training, responding with perfect efficiency. Joe's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't expected to land everything, but neither had he anticipated being so completely neutralized. He recovered quickly, spinning away and resetting. But something had changed. A flicker of doubt had entered his expression, barely noticeable to most but glaring to those who understood fighting. Chuck hadn't countered. He hadn't attacked. He had simply denied Joe the satisfaction of landing the first blow, and in doing so, had established a psychological advantage more powerful than any physical strike. The message was clear. You can't touch me unless I allow it. Joe circled again, his movements now more purposeful, less showmanship. The smirk remained, but it had hardened into something more determined, more focused. He jabbed again, testing Chuck's defenses, looking for openings. Chuck parried easily, his movements minimal and precise. Still, he hadn't thrown a single strike of his own. He was waiting, watching, allowing Joe to exhaust himself both physically and emotionally. "Fight back," Joe growled, frustration beginning to edge into his voice. "Or are you just going to dodge all night?" In response, Chuck simply raised an eyebrow, a gesture so subtle yet so dismissive that it drew an involuntary murmur from the crowd. Without words, he had questioned Joe's worthiness as an opponent, challenged his very understanding of what fighting truly meant. The taunt landed more effectively than any physical blow. Joe's face flushed with anger, his calculated performance giving way to genuine emotion. For the first time, the real Joe Louis was showing through the carefully constructed persona, and he was rattled. "Come on," Joe shouted, launching another flurry of attacks, each one faster and harder than the last. His technique began to suffer as emotion took over, strikes becoming wider, more telegraphed. Chuck weathered the storm with the immovable presence of a mountain facing a strong wind. He blocked, deflected, and evaded, still without countering, still without speaking. His breathing remained measured, his expression calm, his eyes never losing their focus. In the commentator's booth, former fighters watched in awe. "What we're seeing here," whispered one, "is the difference between fighting for show and fighting for real." Joe's trying to win the crowd. Chuck simply focused on Joe. The crowd sensed it too. The Chuck chants had given way to a reverent silence as they witnessed a masterclass in martial arts philosophy played out in real time. This wasn't just about physical technique, it was about mental control, about the discipline that separated true masters from mere fighters. Joe paused, breathing heavily now, frustration evident in every line of his body. Sweat poured down his face, his perfect hair now plastered to his forehead. He had thrown dozens of strikes, each one neutralized with seemingly minimal effort. Worse, Chuck's continued silence and refusal to counterattack felt more demeaning than any insult Joe could have received. "Hit me," Joe demanded, thumping his own chest. "What are you waiting for? Hit me." Chuck tilted his head slightly, studying Joe as one might study a particularly interesting puzzle. Then, with deliberate calm, he shook his head once. The gesture was clear to everyone watching. "You're not ready." Joe's last thread of professional control snapped. With a roar of pure frustration, he charged forward, abandoning technique for raw aggression. This was no longer about winning or showing off. It was about forcing Chuck Norris to acknowledge him, to treat him as an equal worthy of his full attention. It was exactly what Chuck had been waiting for. Joe Louis charged across the cage like a bull seeing red, abandoning all pretense of technique for raw power. His fists flew in wide, looping arcs powerful enough to end the fight if they connected, but telegraphed from a mile away to a fighter of Chuck's caliber. The crowd gasped at the sudden explosion of aggression, the sheer animal ferocity of Joe's attack. "I'll make you fight back," Joe snarled, punctuating each word with another wild swing. Chuck remained centered in the storm, his movements economical and precise. He slipped the first punch by mere millimeters, the air from Joe's fist brushing his beard. The second, he redirected with a subtle parry, using Joe's own momentum to guide the strike away from its target. The third, a haymaker aimed at his temple, he ducked under with the fluid grace of a man half his age. Joe's frustration mounted with each failed attack. His carefully crafted image was unraveling with every second that passed, without landing a clean hit. Sweat flew from his hair as he pivoted, launching a spinning back fist meant to catch Chuck by surprise. But Chuck wasn't there. With timing honed through decades of practice, he had anticipated the move and shifted position, not retreating, but sliding to an angle that rendered Joe's attack harmless while positioning himself perfectly for a counter. Still, the counter didn't come. In the front row, David Chen, his face still showing the marks of his earlier defeat, watched with growing understanding. Next to him, a young fighter leaned over. "Why doesn't Norris hit back? He's had a dozen openings." Chen smiled slightly, wincing as the motion pulled at his split lip. "He's teaching, not fighting." Inside the cage, Joe reset his stance, his chest heaving with exertion and frustration. The cocky grin that had been his trademark was gone, replaced by a grimace of determination. Something was happening that he'd never experienced before. His psychological weapons had failed. His physical attributes were being neutralized. And for the first time in his career, he was facing an opponent who seemed to be controlling the fight without even striking. "What's the matter, old man?" Joe taunted, the strain evident in his voice. "Afraid to throw those famous kicks? Afraid they might not work without a camera trick?" Chuck's expression never changed, but something shifted in his eyes, not anger, but a decision made. The time for pure defense had passed. The lesson was entering its next phase. As Joe launched his next combination, a jab, cross, and roundhouse kick, Chuck finally moved to counter. The movement was so fast that many in the audience missed it entirely. One moment Joe was attacking, the next he was stumbling backward, a red mark blooming on his ribcage, where Chuck's perfectly timed counterpunch had slipped through his guard. The crowd erupted, the sudden shift in momentum releasing the tension that had been building. Joe's eyes widened in shock, not just at being hit, but at the precision and power behind the strike. It hadn't been thrown with anger or maximum force. It had been calculated to make a point, to demonstrate the gulf in skill between showmanship and mastery. "Ladies and gentlemen," the commentator's voice cut through the crowd noise, "what we just witnessed was Chuck Norris's legendary counter-striking, the same technique that won him 6 consecutive world titles. Perfect timing. Perfect placement." Joe recovered quickly. His pride stung more than his body. The flash of shock in his eyes hardened into determination. This was no longer about humiliating a movie star. It was about survival against a legitimate threat. He circled more cautiously now, respect reluctantly entering his stance and movement. Gone were the theatrical feints and unnecessary flourishes. Joe Louis was finally fighting like a professional, not a performer. "That's one," Joe said, his voice low and controlled. "Let's see if you can do it again." Chuck didn't respond verbally. He simply resumed his ready position, hands raised, balance perfect, the same fundamentally sound stance he had taught thousands of students over the years. In that moment, he wasn't just fighting Joe Louis. He was representing an entire philosophy of martial arts that emphasized substance over style, discipline over display. Joe attacked again, this time with more technical precision. A probing jab, followed by a legitimate combination designed to test Chuck's defenses rather than overwhelm them. It was the approach of a fighter who had reassessed his opponent and adjusted accordingly. Chuck nodded slightly, acknowledging the improvement. Then he demonstrated why he was still the master. As Joe's combination unfolded, Chuck's counters came with surgical precision. A check to the jab, a slip of the cross, and then a counter-strike delivered with such perfect timing that it caught Joe between movements when he was most vulnerable. Again, the hit wasn't delivered with maximum power. It wasn't meant to knock Joe out, but to educate him. Each strike was a sentence in a larger lesson about respecting the art, about understanding the difference between fighting for applause and fighting with purpose. Joe staggered slightly, genuinely surprised by the speed and accuracy of the counter. For a man who had built his career on being the faster, more dynamic fighter, it was a humbling moment to be beaten to the punch by someone nearly 20 years his senior. In the commentator's booth, the analysts were beside themselves. What we're seeing here is exactly why Chuck Norris was considered the greatest counter-striker in karate history. One explained. It's not about age or strength, it's about timing, about seeing opportunities that other fighters miss. The other commentator nodded. And notice what he's doing. He's not trying to hurt Louis. He's systematically dismantling his technique, exposing the flaws in his approach. This isn't a fight, it's a master class. In the cage, Joe wiped sweat from his brow, reassessing his strategy. The confident smirk was completely gone now, replaced by the intense concentration of an athlete who suddenly realized he was outmatched, but refused to concede. Lucky counter? Joe muttered, more to himself than to Chuck. Chuck's only response was to slightly adjust his stance, preparing for the next exchange. His breathing remained measured, his focus unwavering. Where Joe was showing the physical and emotional strain of the unexpected challenge, Chuck looked as if he could continue this demonstration indefinitely. Joe attacked again, and again Chuck countered, each time with different techniques, each time targeting different openings, each time demonstrating another aspect of fighting that Joe's flashy style had neglected. A check to the leg here, a counter to the body there. A subtle off-balancing that left Joe momentarily vulnerable. None of the strikes were delivered with knockout power, but their cumulative effect was devastating, not just physically, but psychologically. Joe was being taken apart, not by strength or speed, but by skill and experience, by a deeper understanding of the very art he had claimed to represent. The crowd sensed the shift in momentum. The Chuck chants resumed, growing louder with each successful counter. Even some of Joe's dedicated fans were now watching in awe as a legend demonstrated why he had earned his reputation long before Hollywood came calling. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Joe resorted to his specialty, the spinning heel kick that had become his signature, the move that had ended many of his previous fights. He launched into it with everything he had, his body twisting in a perfect arc, leg extended like a scythe, meant to separate Chuck's consciousness from his body. It was beautiful, technical, and powerful, a kick that would have ended the fight against almost any other opponent. Almost. Chuck saw it coming. Not just the kick itself, but the desperation behind it. In that split second, as Joe's body rotated and his leg rose, Chuck made a decision. This wasn't just about countering anymore. It was about teaching a final, unforgettable lesson about the difference between flashy technique and functional mastery. As Joe's kick approached its target, Chuck did the unthinkable. He stepped into the attack rather than away from it. With timing that bordered on precognitive, he slipped inside the arc of Joe's kick, rendering its power useless. In the same fluid motion, he delivered a perfectly placed strike to Joe's supporting leg, compromising his balance at the most vulnerable moment of his technique. Joe's eyes widened in shock as he felt his center of gravity shift unexpectedly. His spectacular kick cut through empty air as his body betrayed him, sending him stumbling awkwardly across the cage, all grace and control momentarily abandoned. The crowd gasped collectively. What they had just witnessed wasn't just a defensive move, it was a master exposing the fundamental flaw in a student's approach, prioritizing spectacle over substance, flash over function. Joe regained his footing, but something had changed irrevocably. The last vestiges of his cocky persona had been stripped away, leaving only the raw fighter underneath, talented but incomplete, powerful but unrefined. In his eyes now was something new. Respect tinged with fear. The sudden, humbling recognition of true mastery. Chuck hadn't even thrown his own famous kick yet. He hadn't needed to. The lesson was being delivered through pure technique, through the kind of fighting knowledge that couldn't be acquired through shortcuts or natural talent alone, but only through decades of dedicated practice and honest self-assessment. This, the veteran commentator whispered into his microphone, is what martial arts is truly about. Not domination, not humiliation, but education, the constant pursuit of improvement, the humble acknowledgement that there is always more to learn. In the cage, Joe was learning that lesson in the most public, most painful way possible, not through physical punishment, but through the systematic deconstruction of everything he thought he knew about fighting. Chuck stood calmly in the center of the cage, waiting for Joe's next move. His expression remained unchanged, neither gloating in his dominance nor dismissive of his opponent's efforts. There was only focus, only presence, only the absolute concentration of a master, fully engaged in his art. The message was clear to everyone watching. This is what a lifetime of disciplined practice looks like. This is the difference between someone who fights for applause and someone who embodies the deeper principles of martial arts. Joe Louis stood at a crossroads, facing a choice that would define not just this moment, but his entire career. He could continue as before, relying on flash and aggression, or he could acknowledge the lesson being offered and grow from it. With a deep breath, Joe nodded slightly to Chuck, the first genuine show of respect he'd displayed all night. Then he raised his hands into a more traditional guard position, mirroring Chuck's fundamentally sound stance. The crowd recognized the significance of the gesture, and a murmur of appreciation rippled through the arena. This was Joe Louis, the self-proclaimed future of fighting, adapting his style in real time based on the lessons being taught by a true master. But Chuck knew better than to take the gesture at face value. He had seen too many fighters make temporary adjustments under pressure, only to revert to their old habits when the moment passed. True change required more than a single moment of humility. It required a fundamental shift in perspective. As Joe approached with his new, more measured stance, Chuck nodded slightly in acknowledgement. Then, with timing that seemed almost supernatural, he launched into the move everyone had been waiting for, the legendary Chuck Norris roundhouse kick. Unlike Joe's flashy spinning techniques, there was nothing excessive about Chuck's kick. No wasted motion, no unnecessary rotation, just pure functional efficiency delivered with decades of refined power. It was so fast that many in the audience didn't see it until Joe was already staggering backward, a look of shocked respect on his face. The kick hadn't been delivered at full power. This wasn't about causing injury. It had been precisely calibrated to make a point. This is what real technique looks like. This is what happens when flash is stripped away and only function remains. Joe touched his jaw where the kick had connected, his eyes wide with a new understanding. He had spent years developing his own spectacular version of the roundhouse, adding spins and jumps to impress the crowd. In that moment, facing the pure, unadorned perfection of Chuck's traditional technique, he understood what he had been missing. The lesson was complete. The Los Angeles sports arena pulsed with a new kind of energy. The initial bloodlust of the crowd had transformed into something more profound, a collective appreciation for the martial arts clinic they were witnessing. Camera flashes punctuated the hush that had fallen over the spectators, each person understanding that they were watching something historic unfold. Joe Louis stood in the center of the cage, breathing hard, a thin trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth where Chuck's roundhouse had connected. The cocky grin that had been his trademark was gone, replaced by an expression of grim determination. This was no longer about showmanship or ego. It was about survival with dignity against a superior opponent. Across from him, Chuck Norris waited calmly, his breathing controlled, his stance unchanged since the beginning of their encounter. The contrast between the two fighters could not have been more stark, Joe showing every sign of physical and emotional strain, Chuck appearing as if he could continue at this pace indefinitely. "I'm not done yet," Joe said, his voice low enough that only Chuck and those nearest the cage could hear. Chuck nodded slightly, acknowledging Joe's resilience. Despite everything, the younger fighter had not quit, had not made excuses. There was genuine talent there, genuine potential beneath the manufactured persona. Perhaps, Chuck thought, there was hope for Joe Louis after all. But first, there was one more lesson to deliver. Joe reset his stance, abandoning the wide, showy posture he had used throughout his career for something more traditional, more fundamentally sound. It was an admission of sorts, a tacit acknowledgement that his approach had been found wanting. He began to circle cautiously, studying Chuck with new respect, looking for openings with the focused attention of a student rather than the arrogance of a self-proclaimed master. In the commentator's booth, the analysts leaned forward in fascination. "Look at that," one whispered. "Louis has completely changed his approach. He's fighting like a traditional martial artist now, not a showman." "That's the mark of a true fighter," the other replied. "The ability to adapt, to learn even in the middle of combat. Question is it too late?" In the cage, Joe launched a new attack, more measured than before, more technically sound. A probing jab, followed by a clean cross, ending with a textbook leg kick. Each movement was executed with precision rather than flash, focused on effectiveness rather than appearance. Chuck parried the combination with his usual efficiency, but there was a slight nod of acknowledgement the improvement had been noted. He countered with a short, sharp jab that caught Joe on the chest, just enough to create distance and reset the engagement. "Better," Chuck said, breaking his silence for only the second time. "Much better." Something flickered in Joe's eyes. Pride, perhaps, at earning even this small praise from a legend. But there was something else, too. A dawning realization that this was what he had been missing throughout his meteoric rise. Not just technique, but mentorship. Not just victory, but growth. The crowd sensed the shift in dynamic, the subtle transformation from a grudge match into something more meaningful. The Chuck chants had given way to appreciative murmurs as the audience recognized they were witnessing not just a fight, but a transformative moment in a young fighter's journey. Joe attacked again, building on the foundation of his previous attempt. This time, he incorporated elements of Chuck's style, the economy of movement, the perfect balance, the focus on function over form. It wasn't a perfect imitation, but it showed an ability to learn, to adapt, to evolve. Chuck defended smoothly. But this time Joe managed to graze him with a follow-up strike, not enough to do damage, but enough to demonstrate improvement. A ripple of appreciative applause spread through the crowd. This was no longer about seeing a cocky youngster get his comeuppance. It was about witnessing the real-time evolution of a fighter under the ultimate pressure. Joe's confidence grew. Not the manufactured bravado of before, but something more substantial, the quiet self-assurance that comes from honest effort and incremental improvement. He pressed forward with renewed purpose, stringing together combinations that showed genuine technical merit. Chuck continued to defend and counter, but there was a subtle shift in his approach as well. He was no longer simply neutralizing. He was guiding, creating openings that tested Joe's adaptation, challenging him to recognize and exploit opportunities that a less experienced fighter would miss. It was teaching through combat, the oldest, most direct form of martial arts instruction, passed down through generations from master to student. For a brief, transcendent moment, both fighters and audience were elevated beyond the spectacle of sport into something timeless. The pure transmission of knowledge through action, the wordless communication of wisdom earned through decades of dedicated practice. Then Joe made his move. Perhaps it was inevitable, the lure of the spectacular too deeply ingrained to be abandoned completely. Perhaps it was strategic, a calculated risk based on the belief that only something unexpected could penetrate Chuck's perfect defense. Or perhaps it was simply pride, a final attempt to prove that his style had merit after all. Whatever the reason, Joe suddenly launched into his signature technique, the spinning heel kick that had defined his career, the move he had spent countless hours perfecting. But this time, it was different. This time, it incorporated the lessons learned in the heat of combat. The unnecessary flourishes were gone, the showboating eliminated. What remained was the pure, functional core of the technique, executed with genuine technical skill. It was beautiful to behold power and precision in perfect harmony. Joe's body rotating like a top, generating centrifugal force that transferred into his extended leg as it arced toward Chuck's head. In that suspended moment, as Joe's kick sliced through the air, something like respect flickered across Chuck's face. The kid had learned. Not completely, not perfectly. But he had shown the capacity to grow, to integrate new knowledge even under the most challenging circumstances. Then, Chuck moved. What happened next would be debated in martial arts circles for decades to come. Some would claim it was simply superior timing, the product of thousands of hours of practice. Others would insist it was almost supernatural, a demonstration of fighting intuition that transcended normal human capability. As Joe's kick approached its target, Chuck executed the perfect counter, not by retreating or blocking, but by launching his own signature move, the legendary Chuck Norris roundhouse kick, the technique that had won him world championships, the move that had later become his cinematic trademark. The two kicks met in midair, youth versus experience, spectacle versus substance, the future facing the past. There was a moment of perfect symmetry. Both fighters suspended in space, legs extended, bodies rotating. A tableau of martial arts excellence that caused the entire arena to hold its collective breath. Then physics took over. Chuck's timing was milliseconds better, his balance imperceptibly superior, his technique honed by decades of relentless practice. His kick slipped under Joe's, connecting solidly while Joe's whistled harmlessly overhead. The impact wasn't brutal or devastating. Chuck had calibrated his power precisely, but it was decisive. Joe's rotation was interrupted, his balance compromised at the most vulnerable point of his technique. For a heartbeat, he seemed to hang, suspended, defying gravity through sheer determination. Then, he fell. Not dramatically, not violently, but with the quiet finality of a lesson conclusively delivered. He hit the mat with a soft thud that somehow echoed through the silent arena more powerfully than any crash or bang could have. Chuck immediately stepped back, making no move to press his advantage, offering no triumphant gesture to the crowd. He simply returned to his ready stance, waiting to see if the fight would continue. Joe lay on his back for a moment, staring up at the arena lights, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. He had thrown his best technique improved by the very lessons Chuck had been teaching him and still found himself on the canvas. Not because of superior strength or speed, but because of superior mastery, superior understanding, superior discipline. The referee moved in, prepared to start a count, but Joe was already moving. Not rushing, not scrambling, but rising with deliberate dignity. He got to his feet, touched the spot where Chuck's kick had connected, and then did something no one in the arena expected. He bowed. It was a proper bow, formal and respectful, the kind traditional martial artists perform to acknowledge a master. The gesture contained volumes, recognition, respect, gratitude for the lesson taught and received. The arena erupted, not with bloodthirsty cheers or vengeful satisfaction, but with genuine appreciation for what they had witnessed, a moment of transformation, a public acknowledgement of the true spirit of martial arts that transcended winning and losing. Chuck returned the bow, his expression solemn but his eyes conveying something unspoken acknowledgement of Joe's potential. Recognition of his courage, perhaps even a hint of what might be possible if the young fighter continued on this new path. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. Everything that needed to be said had been communicated through action, through the most ancient and direct language of combat. The referee looked from one fighter to the other, uncertain how to proceed in this unprecedented situation. But before he could make a decision, Joe turned and walked toward the cage door, making it clear that the exhibition was over. As he passed Chuck, he paused briefly. "Thank you," he said simply, quietly enough that only Chuck could hear. Chuck nodded once, neither dismissive nor effusive, just the simple acknowledgement of one martial artist to another. Joe continued to the cage door and exited, disappearing down the tunnel that led to the locker rooms. There was no tantrum, no excuses, no attempt to salvage his ego with hollow explanations. He left with more dignity than he had entered, with perhaps the most important victory of the night. In the center of the cage, Chuck remained still for a moment, the eye of the hurricane as the crowd's reactions swirled around him. He had come tonight as a spectator and found himself a reluctant teacher. He had faced disrespect and responded not with anger but with education. He had been challenged to prove his legitimacy and had done so not by destroying his challenger, but by elevating him. Without fanfare, without celebration, Chuck turned and walked to the same exit Joe had used. His expression remained as calm and focused as it had been throughout the encounter, no triumph, no pride, just the quiet satisfaction of a martial artist who had honored his art in the most authentic way possible. As he disappeared from view, the crowd's cheers followed him, transformed from the bloodlust of spectacle into something more profound appreciation for a demonstration of what martial arts, at its core, was truly about. Not winning or losing, not humiliation or domination, but growth, respect, and the never-ending journey toward mastery. The locker room corridor was a stark contrast to the electric atmosphere of the arena, concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, and a silence broken only by the distant echo of the crowd still processing what they had witnessed. Chuck Norris walked unhurriedly down the hallway, his footsteps measured and even his breathing already returned to normal despite the exertion of the impromptu bout. Ahead of him, Joe Louis sat alone on a bench outside the main locker room, head bowed, still in his fight gear. The younger fighter looked up as Chuck approached, the cockiness completely gone from his expression, replaced by something more complex, humility tinged with confusion, respect shadowed by the painful process of reevaluating everything he thought he knew. Joe stood as Chuck reached him, instinctively straightening his posture. "I didn't expect you to actually come down," he admitted, his voice stripped of its earlier bravado. "I thought—" He stopped, reconsidering his words. "I didn't think." Chuck nodded slightly, neither condemning nor absolving. "Thinking comes after," he said simply. The two fighters stood in silence for a moment, the gap in age and experience between them suddenly more apparent in this quiet corridor than it had been in the charged atmosphere of combat. Joe's youth seemed more pronounced now, not just physically, but in the raw, unformed quality of his potential. "I've won 15 straight fights," Joe said finally, not boasting but seemingly trying to reconcile his past success with his current defeat. "Knocked out everyone they put in front of me." "I know," Chuck replied. "I've seen the tapes." Joe looked up, surprise evident on his face. "You watched my fights?" "I study all promising fighters." Chuck's tone was matter-of-fact, neither flattering nor dismissive. "You have natural talent, good speed, power." The implied "but" hung in the air between them. Joe waited for the criticism, the breakdown of his flaws, the lecture on respect that he probably deserved after his public challenge. Instead, Chuck simply turned to continue down the corridor. "Wait," Joe called after him, a note of desperation entering his voice. "That's it? You're not going to tell me what I did wrong?" Chuck paused, considering the question with the same deliberate care he brought to everything. "You already know," he said finally. "Otherwise, you wouldn't be asking." The truth of the statement landed like a physical blow. Joe had spent his career cultivating an image, playing to crowds, mistaking attention for respect. Deep down, he had known something was missing, something that separated fighters like him from masters like Chuck Norris. Tonight, that gap had been exposed in the most public way possible. "I want to be better," Joe said quietly, the admission clearly costing him more than any physical pain could have. Not just win, actually be better. Something shifted in Chuck's expression, not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes, a recognition of the courage it took to speak those words after what had transpired. "That's the first step," he acknowledged. "Maybe the hardest one." Further down the corridor, a door opened. David Chen emerged from the medical room, his face still showing the marks of his earlier defeat by Joe. He stopped when he saw the two fighters, clearly surprised to find them together outside the cage. Joe tensed visibly, shame washing over his features as he faced the man he had humiliated and mocked just hours before. The contrast between his treatment of Chen and Chuck's treatment of him could not have been more stark. Arrogance versus instruction, humiliation versus education. Chuck watched silently, offering neither prompting nor interference. This was Joe's moment, his opportunity to demonstrate whether the lessons of the night had truly been absorbed or merely survived. After a moment of hesitation, Joe stepped forward and extended his hand to Chen. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "The way I acted after our fight. It wasn't right. You deserve better." Chen studied Joe's face, searching for sincerity, perhaps expecting to find the same mocking smirk that had accompanied his defeat. Finding only genuine remorse, he accepted the handshake. "We all have things to learn," he said with quiet dignity. "Some lessons are harder than others." Something flickered in Chen's eyes. Not forgiveness exactly, for that would take time, but recognition. The beginning of a bridge across a chasm that Joe himself had created. Chen looked past Joe to Chuck, a question in his expression. "He's learning," Chuck said simply, and Chen nodded, understanding the significance of those two words coming from someone of Chuck's stature. The path is long, Chen replied, addressing both Chuck and Joe. But worth walking. He touched his bruised face gently, a physical reminder of the evening's events. Perhaps we'll meet again when the journey has progressed further. The exchange was brief but profound, a microcosm of the larger transformation taking place, the first concrete evidence that Joe's change might be more than temporary. As Chen continued past them toward the exit, a group of tournament officials rounded the corner, clipboards in hand, expressions a mixture of concern and excitement. "Mr. Norris," the lead official began, slightly breathless. "The network wants to know if you'd consider a post-fight interview. What happened out there is already going viral. Well, it would be going viral if social media existed." He corrected himself with a nervous laugh. "The phones haven't stopped ringing. Sports Illustrated is calling. ABC, NBC. Everyone wants a statement." Chuck shook his head once, a simple, definitive gesture that required no elaboration. His silence spoke volumes about what truly mattered to him, about the difference between seeking publicity and living with purpose. The official glanced at Joe, clearly hoping for a more media-friendly response from the younger fighter. But Joe remained quiet, still processing the exchange with Chen and the larger lessons of the evening. "At least consider a joint appearance," the official pressed. "This could be huge for both your careers. For the sport itself. People are calling it the most significant martial arts moment since Bruce Lee." "No," Chuck said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "What happened in there wasn't for cameras. It was between fighters." The official seemed about to argue further. But something in Chuck's demeanor, the quiet authority that required no validation from external sources, made him reconsider. With a reluctant nod, he motioned to his colleagues, and they retreated back down the corridor, already discussing alternative angles for the post-event coverage. Joe watched them go, a thoughtful expression replacing his earlier shame. 6 months ago, I would have been chasing them down, he admitted, trying to turn it into more publicity, more attention. "And now?" Chuck asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Joe turned back to him, new resolve in his expression. "I want to train properly," he said. "Not just for show or for winning, but to understand what you showed me tonight. To earn real respect, not just attention." Chuck considered him for a long moment, assessing not just his words, but the intent behind them. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, simple white stock with black lettering, no flashy logo or design. "My dojo in Torrance," he said, offering the card. "Monday morning, 6 a.m. Don't be late." Joe accepted the card with the reverence of someone receiving a rare gift, understanding the opportunity it represented, not just technical instruction, but mentorship from a living legend. "I'll be there," he promised. And for the first time that night, there was no performance in his voice, no calculated effect, just simple, earnest determination. Chuck nodded once, then continued down the corridor toward the exit, his mission for the evening complete. He had come as a spectator and found himself drawn into something more significant, not just a defense of his reputation, but a chance to reshape a talented young fighter who had lost his way in the glare of the spotlight. As the corridor door closed behind Chuck, Joe remained standing, the business card still in his hand, the weight of everything that had transpired settling around him. His carefully constructed persona had been dismantled, his technical flaws exposed, his assumptions about fighting fundamentally challenged. Yet somehow, he felt lighter than he had in years. The exhausting effort of maintaining his cocky image, of constantly proving himself through dominance and disrespect, had been replaced by something more sustainable, the humble recognition of how much he still had to learn, the clear path forward that came with accepting his limitations. From the locker room doorway, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Guess you're not the hotshot you thought you were, huh?" It was Mike Sullivan, another fighter on the tournament roster, a mid-tier competitor who had always resented Joe's meteoric rise. There was vindictive satisfaction in his tone, the unmistakable pleasure of seeing someone brought low. A month ago, Joe would have responded with a cutting insult, would have used his verbal skills to humiliate Sullivan just as he had used his physical skills to humiliate opponents in the cage. The muscle memory of arrogance twitched within him, the familiar words rising to his lips. Instead, he looked at the business card in his hand, thinking of the example Chuck had set, responding to disrespect not with more disrespect, but with quiet dignity and self-control. "You're right," Joe said simply. "I've got a lot to learn." Sullivan blinked, clearly thrown by the unexpected response. He had been preparing for a confrontation, not a concession. Without Joe's reactivity to feed on, his own aggression seemed suddenly hollow and misplaced. "Whatever," Sullivan muttered, unable to gain satisfaction from a target who refused to behave as expected. He retreated back into the locker room, leaving Joe alone with his thoughts once more. It was a small moment, insignificant compared to the public display in the cage, but in some ways even more meaningful proof that the change had begun to take root, that the lesson wasn't just about fighting technique, but about how to move through the world with greater awareness and self-control. Meanwhile, in the arena, the crowd was still buzzing with excitement, replaying the unprecedented events they had witnessed. Commentators struggled to put the experience into words, to capture the significance of what had transpired between the brash young fighter and the legendary master. "What we saw tonight," the veteran commentator was saying, "transcended sport." It was a perfect encapsulation of what martial arts, at its core, is truly about: the journey from arrogance to humility, from showmanship to substance. His colleague nodded in agreement. Joe Louis came in tonight as the self-proclaimed future of fighting, all flash and bravado. Chuck Norris showed all of us what real mastery looks like. Not just technical skill, but the character and discipline behind it. In the press section, journalists typed frantically, knowing they were documenting a moment that would be referenced for years to come. The headlines were already writing themselves: Norris schools Louis an impromptu martial arts clinic. Chuck proves kicks are no movie trick. Arrogance meets mastery. Norris delivers lesson in respect. But perhaps the most significant conversations were taking place in the stands, as fans gathered their belongings and prepared to leave. Parents explained to their children what they had witnessed, not just an exciting confrontation, but a demonstration of values that extended far beyond the cage. "That's why we train," one father told his wide-eyed son. "Not to show off or put others down, but to develop the kind of discipline and control Chuck Norris showed tonight." A group of young martial arts students huddled together, dissecting the technical aspects of what they had seen. "Did you see how minimal his movements were?" one asked excitedly. "No wasted energy. No unnecessary flash. Just perfect timing and technique. And he never lost his cool," another added. Even when Louis was taunting him, he stayed focused on what mattered. In a different section of the arena, a veteran martial arts instructor sat with his advanced students, using the fresh memory of the encounter as an impromptu teaching opportunity. "What Chuck demonstrated tonight wasn't just physical mastery," he explained, his students hanging on every word. "It was philosophical mastery. The ability to respond rather than react. To teach rather than punish. To elevate rather than humiliate. That's the difference between someone who knows techniques and someone who embodies the art." One of the students, a talented young woman with championship potential, furrowed her brow thoughtfully. But if Lewis was being so disrespectful, didn't he deserve to be humiliated? To be taught a lesson? The instructor smiled. That's exactly the point. Chuck did teach him a lesson, the most powerful one possible. Not by giving him what he deserved, but by giving him what he needed. That's the mark of a true teacher. And ultimately, that's what great martial artists become. Throughout the arena, the impact of the evening was rippling outward, touching everyone who had witnessed it in different ways. For some, it was primarily entertainment, an unexpected drama that had delivered more excitement than the scheduled bouts. For others, particularly those involved in martial arts themselves, it was something closer to a revelation, a rare glimpse of pure mastery in a world increasingly dominated by hype and image. 3 months later, the West Coast Martial Arts Championship returned to Los Angeles. The arena was packed once again, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. But something was different this time. Something in the way the event was presented, in the behavior of the fighters, in the expectations of the crowd. In the locker room area, Joe Louis prepared for his bout. His hair was shorter now, the flashy mullet replaced by a more practical cut. His custom gi was gone too, exchanged for a traditional white uniform with no sponsorship patches or decorative elements. But the most notable change was in his demeanor, the performative cockiness replaced by quiet focus, the need for attention transformed into the desire for excellence. A knock at the door interrupted his preparation. Chuck Norris entered, now in the role of cornerman rather than opponent. For the past 3 months, Joe had shown up at the Torrance dojo every morning without fail, absorbing not just technical instruction, but the deeper principles of martial arts that Chuck had spent a lifetime mastering. "Ready?" Chuck asked simply. Joe nodded, his expression serious but confident, not the manufactured confidence of his earlier career, but the genuine self-assurance that comes from proper preparation and honest self-assessment. "Remember," Chuck said, "tonight isn't about proving anything to anyone else. It's about honoring the art, respecting your opponent, and continuing your growth." "I understand," Joe replied. And the simple statement contained worlds of development, a testament to how far he had come since that fateful night 3 months before. Together, they walked toward the arena, master and student. The younger man, no longer in need of spotlights and spectacle to feel validated, the older man satisfied that his impromptu lesson had yielded more fruit than he could have anticipated. As they reached the entrance to the arena, the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the cage, Joe Louis." Joe paused at the threshold, taking a deep breath. Chuck placed a hand on his shoulder, a simple gesture of support, one martial artist to another. "Thank you," Joe said quietly. "Not just for the training, but for that night. For showing me the difference between being strong and being a master." Chuck nodded, acknowledging the gratitude without need for elaboration. They both knew what he meant the night that had changed not just Joe's career, but his understanding of what it meant to be a martial artist. Joe stepped into the arena, greeted not by his old entrance music, but by the respectful applause of fans who had witnessed his transformation. He raised a single hand in acknowledgement, his demeanor neither arrogant nor showy, but dignified and focused. In that moment, as he approached the cage where his next challenge awaited, Joe Louis embodied the lesson that Chuck Norris had taught him 3 months before, that true strength lies not in dominating others, but in mastering oneself. That real respect cannot be demanded through intimidation, but must be earned through character and skill. That the loudest voice is rarely the wisest. And that, in martial arts, as in life, substance will always triumph over spectacle in the end. Behind him, Chuck Norris watched with quiet satisfaction. The student was becoming a teacher in his own right, passing on the lessons of respect and discipline to a new generation. The cycle continued. The ancient wisdom of martial arts flowing forward, unchanging in its essence, despite the evolving world around it. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. Not what happened in the cage that night, but what continued to happen long after the lights had dimmed and the crowd had gone home. The enduring power of respect, discipline, and humility, passed from master to student, from generation to generation, preserving the true heart of martial arts in an age increasingly fixated on image over substance. In the end, it wasn't about who could throw the flashiest kick or talk the biggest game. It was about who could walk the long, difficult path of self-improvement with patience and perseverance. It was about understanding that the journey never ends, that there is always more to learn, and that the greatest opponent any martial artist will ever face is not across the cage, but in the mirror. That was the lesson Chuck Norris taught Joe Louis that night in Los Angeles. That was the true art behind the fighting. That was the silent power of the master. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.